sound in the walls. Sarah lived alone in an old Victorian house. It was a beautiful place, with creaky floorboards and stained glass windows. But it was also a place of shadows and whispers. She'd moved in after a painful breakup, seeking solitude and a fresh start. But the house seemed to have other plans. At first, it was just the creaks and groans of an aging building. The wind whistling through the chimney sounded like mournful wails. The old house settled with a series of pops and cracks that echoed through the night. But then, something changed. A soft scratching sound began to emanate from the walls. At first, she thought it was mice, but the sound was too consistent, too rhythmic. It was as if something was moving behind the plaster, tiny claws scraping against the wood. She tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the sound grew louder, more insistent. Days turned into nights filled with terror. She would lie in bed, eyes wide open, listening to the scratching. Sometimes it seemed to follow her from room to room. It would start softly, a distant whisper, then grow louder and louder until it felt like it was right next to her. She called in an exterminator, but he found no evidence of rodents. The house was inspected for structural damage, but nothing was found. The scratching continued, a relentless, maddening presence. Sarah started to see shadows moving in the corners of her vision, figures that seemed to flicker and disappear. She'd catch glimpses of them out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing there. The scratching evolved. It became more complex, almost like a coded message. There were pauses, variations in rhythm. It was as if something was trying to communicate with her. She started to believe it was alive, intelligent. Paranoia set in. She checked every corner of the house, looking for signs of an intruder. She slept with a knife under her pillow, ready to defend herself. But there was no one there, just the house and the sound. The scratching began to take on a human quality. It sounded like someone was trying to speak, their voice muffled by the wall. She could hear words forming, but they were garbled, incomprehensible. One night, as she lay in bed, paralyzed by fear, she heard a new sound. It was a soft knocking, coming from the wall next to her bed. Her heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the wall vibrating. And then, a voice, clear and distinct, whispered her name. Sarah screamed. Sarah's scream echoed through the empty house, a desperate plea for help. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped her heart. She pulled the covers over her head, but the darkness was no protection. The house seemed to change. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a sinister underbelly. Shadows danced in grotesque patterns on the walls. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. A foul odor, like rotting flesh, filled the room. Days turned into a blur of terror. Sarah existed in a state of constant fear. She barely ate, her body trembling with each passing hour. The scratching continued, more insistent than ever. The voice that whispered her name became a constant companion, a mocking whisper in the darkness. One night, the scratching stopped. A silence fell over the house, a heavy, oppressive silence. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears. She was alone, or so she thought. Then, a creak from the floorboards. A shadow moved across the wall, long and sinister. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed an eerie blue. Its skin was pale and translucent, and its hands were long and claw-like. The creature moved towards her, its steps slow and deliberate. Sarah froze, unable to move. The creature stopped in front of her bed, its face inches from hers. Its eyes bored into her soul, and she felt a cold emptiness spreading through her. Then it spoke. "You are mine," it whispered, its voice like ice. A wave of nausea washed over Sarah. She felt herself slipping away, fading into darkness. As consciousness slipped from her grasp, she heard the creature laugh, a chilling sound that echoed through the house. Sarah awoke with a jolt, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was bathed in an eerie, moonlight glow. The creature was gone. A cold sweat broke out on her skin as she scanned the room, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. She was alone, or so it seemed. A strange sensation crept over her, a feeling of detachment, as if she were watching herself from outside her body. She looked down at her hands, and they seemed unfamiliar, almost translucent. A wave of terror washed over her as she realized she was changing. Her body felt cold and numb, and she could feel a strange energy coursing through her veins. The scratching started again, but this time, it was inside her head. A voice, cold and distant, spoke to her, telling her to embrace the darkness, to become one with the house. The voice was familiar, the same voice that had whispered her name. Resistance was futile. The darkness consumed her, pulling her into a void of nothingness. As she slipped away, she saw a reflection of herself in the mirror. Her eyes glowed an eerie blue, just like the creatures. She was no longer Sarah. She was something else entirely. Sarah awoke to a world transformed. The house, once a comforting sanctuary, was now a sinister entity, its walls pulsating with a dark energy. She was no longer human. Her body felt alien, a vessel for something ancient and evil. Her reflection in the mirror was a grotesque caricature of her former self. Her skin was pale and translucent, with veins of dark, inky blackness winding beneath the surface. Her eyes, once a warm brown, now glowed with an unnatural blue light. The voice in her head, the voice of the house, was constant, a relentless whisper urging her forward. She was no longer afraid. Fear had been replaced by a cold, detached indifference. She was a creature of the night, a predator stalking the darkness. The house was her domain, and she was its queen. She began to explore the house with a new perspective. Hidden passages and secret rooms revealed themselves, filled with strange artifacts and occult symbols. The house was alive, a sentient being with a dark purpose, and she was its chosen instrument. As days turned into nights, Sarah's transformation accelerated. Her body grew stronger, her senses sharpened. She developed an uncanny ability to sense the presence of others, even those hidden in the shadows. The voice in her head grew louder, more insistent, revealing dark secrets about the house and its history. She discovered that the house had been built on an ancient burial ground, a place of dark power. The creatures that lived within the walls were not of this world. They were ancient, malevolent entities that had been trapped for centuries. And now they were free. Sarah was their queen, their conduit to the world of the living. She was tasked with a terrible purpose: to spread darkness, to corrupt the minds of others, to create an army of the undead.